So right now, we are going to transition to our next panel session, which is going to be moderated by Lebs Malete.
Thank you very much, Upenyu and Isaac. And of course, I need to start off by thanking colleagues that have preceded this session for the very stimulating discussions. My name is Lebs Malete, and I'm an associate professor of sports and exercise psychology at Michigan State University with research interest in youth psychosocial development through sport and physical activity. I'm part of interdisciplinary teams of researchers and practitioners both at MSU here in the Lansing area, University of Botswana, University of Ghana, University of Dar es Salaam, and lately or recently, University of Nigeria and Nsukka, and where we are looking at the use of sport to nurture youth life skills and entrepreneurship. We're really looking at youth development. So, and I'm accompanied today in this session by an esteemed panel of really hardworking, talented individuals. We have Olivia Furman, who's going to introduce herself, and she's an artist and a PhD candidate in curriculum instruction and teacher education at MSU. She will say more about her work and what she does. We also have Taylor Sharp, who is a producer and co-director of Hoops Africa, Ubuntu Matters, a movie. And alongside Taylor Sharp, we have Dan Hedges, who is also co-director of Hoops Africa and Ubuntu Matters. So the three panelists will introduce themselves in more detail and talk about their work. But let me just provide a little our session. We will be focusing on sport and art as signs of youth dialogue and engagement. Our task is to explore the instrumental and aspirational values of art and sport, specifically to look at the philosophical, socio-political, socio-economic underpinnings of this very important work, but with a practitioner perspective, because we'll be talking to individuals who themselves are engaged in this field and doing work on the ground. We'll also want to contextualize this work within Ubuntu, Pan-Africanism, and decolonization. And I think the conversations that we've had since the beginning of this dialogue, offer a very strong basis for our work, allow us to have an engagement. And what you're going to find is that in the process of our discussion, we are effectively bringing into context the role of sport and art in cultural diplomacy. We will actually also have, as a historical background, issues of African-American participation in the anti-apartheid movement, where they expelled apartheid South Africa from the 1968 Olympics. This is historical basis that we have to appreciate about the role of sports in this conversation. We also have to think about sport and art in Pan-Africanism and the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 1970s. We cannot ignore this because we know how these permeated sport, art, and cultural forms during the time. We could also then transition to the 90s and look at, for instance, the 1995 Rugby World Cup in South Africa, where Mandela talked about sport as an equalizer, and how this was seen within the light of Pan-Africanism, or the lens of Pan-Africanism, as well as repositioning South Africa and the African continent on the world stage. Then we move on to the 2010 FIFA World Cup, the first ever World Cup to be held in Africa in 2010, and how that happened. And then the last and final thing to think about, which is also very important, is the Pan-African cultural festivals. For instance, the 2020 festival in Dakar, Senegal, which was themed African Renaissance or Renaissance. So the idea is we think about these historical backgrounds and conceptual frameworks on Ubuntu, Pan-Africanism, decolonization, and the practice of sport and art, and how these help us understand the link between sport and youth development and society, development of society. The panelists are going to spend a good amount of time talking about Ubuntu, and especially as a site of art and youth development. I'm thinking here, for instance, the concept of mutu, ke mutu kabatu in Setswana, umuntu, ngomuntu ngabantu in Guni languages. So all of these concepts intertwine and in many ways help us understand this topic. So without much ado, I'm going to ask Liv to introduce herself, her work, and we take it forward. Liv.
Hey again, everyone. My name is Liv or Olivia. I use she, they pronouns. It's really great to be here. And I, again, want to say thank you so much for the invitation to come, and also all of the amazing conversations that have happened up until this point. I definitely think they've been really informative and have even opened my eyes to the ways that my own work, connects and crosses with and intersects with Ubuntu and Pan-Africanism and decolonization overall. Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the introduction. With the image that's shown right now is a piece of my work. I am an artist and a storyteller. I learned these practices from my maternal grandmother, Mary Frances Furman, and she is with me in so many ways. And I think she's a big part of this piece. And the work that I do, I started my, scholarly research within Black feminist and womanist epistemologies and ontologies and Black women and girls literacies. And I was thinking about ways to engage these within my teaching and learning. And now my focus currently is thinking about the ways those things are embodied within our artful ways of being and knowing, and within storytelling, specifically within things that are healing and focused on self-expression and self-reflection. And all of my focuses come from and are inspired by my own life and my own experiences and the ways that I know that I need healing, especially through a lot of the trauma that I've experienced within school settings. I'm currently a graduate student, and anybody who has been through grad school or any kind of school kind of understands the baggage and trauma that comes with that. And so that's why my focus now is on healing and that work. And I'm really working to bring forward and center the literacies and embodiments that I learned growing up, because that's the way I speak. That's my language. That is how I use my voice. And I've seen the many ways that they have not been included within school settings. And this is the case often for many Black and Brown youth, especially youth who identify as BIPOC or LGBTQIA plus, us queer folks. It's often hard to find spaces within schooling that allow for us to not only engage every aspect of our identity, but also, develop that in a affirming space with others. So that's what I really work to do. And I feel like I don't necessarily use, the academic terms or the terms of Pan-Africanism and Ubuntu and decolonization all of the time. Although I do explicitly think about how to decolonize and how to humanize my teaching and learning. But I very much see the ways that those are intersecting with what I do and how they embody some of the same things of what I do. Yeah, so happy to be a part of the conversation. Looking forward to hearing from our other panelists as well.
Thank you very much, Liv. Taylor, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Liv, and thanks to everyone for listening to our panel. I feel like for the past 8 years or so, I've been screaming about Ubuntu, trying to talk so much about this, both through the film that Dan and I made, the documentary film, the poster you're looking at now, but also through other conversations. So what a privilege it is and what an honor it was to hear from Opinu and to hear from Ubuntu Dialogues to learn of this symposium and to be a part of it. We're really grateful to be here and to talk about the film and most importantly, to learn from others. My background is that I'm from North Carolina, a small town in the mountains of North Carolina, and had the opportunity to go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, UNC, where I was on a scholarship that afforded some summer experiences. And most notably, I spent a summer in Zimbabwe working with this wonderful nonprofit called Hoops for Hope. They use basketball as a vehicle to teach life skills. They work with youth, almost 10,000 across Zimbabwe and South Africa. And all of this goes through basketball, but it's all pinned under their life skills curriculum, of which there are 7 tools. Ubuntu is one of them. So Ubuntu is one of the core principles of Hoops for Hope and of the work they do with their kids. It's not only learning how to shoot a jump shot and how to win games. It's much more than that. It's about HIV/AIDS awareness, it's about conflict resolution, it's about gender equality, self-esteem, sense of humor, Ubuntu, all of these wonderful things that any kid anywhere could benefit from learning. So my summer in Zimbabwe, I was 18, I was 19. And actually on my way back home after 2 months there, I met Dan Hedges, who you'll hear from in a moment, who partnered with me on the film. We met very coincidentally, very serendipitously on the film, or on the plane home, a 17-hour flight from Johannesburg to JFK. And I was just really inspired by the work that Hoops for Hope does. I think there's this idea oftentimes, and me understanding my own positionality in all of this, as this white American young person going in to try to volunteer and help, I learned much more than I could have ever given to Hoops for Hope. And when I came back, I just wanted to be able to apply what I learned and hopefully to be able to lend a hand going forward. So that's kind of been my mission since then, moving through university years and beyond. I spent other summers working in the professional sports realm at a sports agency that represents NBA athletes, and also worked at the league office, the NBA in New York City. And I kind of thought I wanted to go for a career in sports, but it all comes back to Ubuntu for me. It always comes back to Hoops for Hope in Zimbabwe. In 2015, the NBA held the first ever Africa game, which was the first time a US professional sports league had held a game on African soil. They made up a team of all-stars from across the world to play against only African players, Team Africa versus Team World. And it was really a celebration of the growth of the game on the continent. And that's when I realized that I wanted to make a film to be able to celebrate the stories, a lot of basketball stories from across the continent. And Dan came in and partnered with me on that. So we made the film, Hoops Africa, Ubuntu Matters. We've screened it at 36 schools now. We actually get to engage with students very often to talk about Ubuntu, but it's all through basketball. And it's all through storytelling, and just really honored to be here today. That was the first film that got me into producing and directing and filmmaking, and that's what I've been doing full time for the past 5 years, oftentimes at the intersection of sport and social impact. And I feel like in all my endeavors, Ubuntu has kind of been the underpinning of them for nearly a decade now, since I spent that summer in Zimbabwe and saw Ubuntu in action almost every day. So I'm excited to really brag on Hoops for Hope and to tell some of the stories that so inspired me, and to learn from Liv and share some fun stories with Dan.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Dan?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Leps. And thank you, everyone, for it's an honor to be here speaking on the panel, and even more so to spend the morning listening to the other panels and learning a lot. And really enjoyed it. So my name is Dan Hedges. I'm a filmmaker and a director of photography. My intention as a filmmaker has always been to provide an accessible and visual vehicle through which people can tell their stories. So professionally, in addition to creating Hoops for Hope, or Hoops Africa, Ubuntu Matters, and other documentary films, professionally, I have a background working in the camera department on commercials, television shows, shooting commercials for nonprofits, tourism, some travel documentary TV series, as well as narrative television and film. My passion projects, though, have generally gravitated towards short and long form documentaries examining the intersection of art and sport, creativity and athleticism, and mainly how sport can be used as a vehicle for social change. Hoops Africa, Ubuntu Matters is my second feature-length film. The first film before that is called Street Soccer New York, which is about a soccer team in New York City, where I was living at the time, made up of all homeless players, and their journey training for the Street Soccer USA Cup, which is an annual soccer tournament that brings homeless players, homeless teams together from around the country to compete and to bring awareness to the impact that sport can have on people's lives. So that first project was really kind of a catalyst for myself and my creative endeavors moving forward. Opened my eyes to the power that sport can have, and it's something that now seems kind of obvious, but something that there's so much to explore about how that's possible and what can come of that. So I guess without knowing that there was a word for it, I think that Street Soccer New York, that film that I created, was very much a story of Ubuntu, though I had no idea that the word existed, what the concept was. It just, that it very much, the concept of Ubuntu very much lives within sports organically and naturally, and that it can raise all people up and better the lives of everyone. So Taylor told the story of how we met in 2012, and that was, I was just wrapping up that first documentary, and we sat together on a 16-hour flight back to the United States from South Africa. And by the end of that flight, we decided we needed to make a film about Hoops for Hope. And it evolved into a much bigger collection of stories, as Taylor said, about just the growth of the game in Africa and in the world, and how it can impact the youth and just people's lives in general. Yeah, that's our story that's kind of my quick introduction. And yeah, I'm excited to continue the conversation for the next 45 minutes or so, and to continue the morning learning and exploring the concepts of Ubuntu and Pan-Africanism and decolonization from everyone else throughout the day. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I think those are really fabulous introductions that the panel members have provided, because there's going to be a lot of centering of Ubuntu in the conversation. I thought I could quickly share one of the things that as I was growing up, the concept of Ubuntu in Setswana, my language, is Botho, which is B-O-T-H-O, Botho. And the most hurtful thing you can ever hear from anyone is if they say Hana Botho or Hauna Botho, which means you are lacking in humanity or kindness. So so that if anybody says that to you, you feel hurt because of how that matters in African culture and it's embedded in the language and the way people speak. So I'm going to pose questions to each one of you and eventually then invite the audience to take part in the discussion. Let's get started with you, Lee. Can you share your experiences, learnings, what intrigued you to get into this line of work?
So I think it started, I think I mentioned earlier, I learned a lot from my grandmother. She's a storyteller, she's a gardener, she loves to cook, she has taught me most of what I know, and I feel like most of those early seeds were planted there. And that's kind of what got me into the arts and craft in general. As you see, I'm sitting in my quilting area. This is my quilting table. I learned quilting from her, and that is still something that I hold with me and continue to do for family. So as I got older and was in school settings, I started, playing in band. After I got into band, that's when I started doing marching band, and then I got into color guard. I did dance. I was at a arts magnet elementary school when I was growing up, King Elementary in Louisville, Kentucky. And I got into, the choir in church. And, oh, sorry, maybe I need to talk a little louder. I got into the choir in church and things like that, and just grew up with that. And then when I went to college, I joined the gospel choir on campus, and then later became the director of that gospel choir on campus. And I ended up writing my senior thesis about the impact of joining a group that was at the unique intersection of my faith, like race, gender, all of these aspects of myself were able to be accessed and developed within that space. And that is where I really started to think critically about the role of the arts within my own identity development, as well as the role of the arts within teaching and learning. Because up until that point, I never really saw myself as a teacher. Although my mother is a teacher, she has taught me my whole life. She teaches pre-K elementary, and I eventually ended up being a teacher as well. But up until that point, I never really saw myself as a teacher, but I saw that as a unique access point where I started to realize this is what I wanted to do. And I also started to realize the importance and the impact of what I'm teaching, as well as teaching in general. And the what of what I was able to teach with the gospel choir was, it was about praise and worship. It was about singing. It was about the musicality as well as the intention behind it. And that was something that has stuck with me and has informed what I'm doing now. So now I'm teaching through the arts and using arts for healing purposes, because I'm, trying to really lean into and engage with the idea and the understanding that the arts do allow for healing. They allow for that self-expression. I think Mr. Johnson earlier was saying that sometimes, visual literacy, seeing visually allow for you to access and input stuff you can always put into words. And for me, that's really important because within the academy, we have this really capitalist notion of production, and especially production in the form of empirical research and writing. And that doesn't sit with me. I don't work that way. I struggle with depression and anxiety and deadlines and all that kind of stuff. And that's all we do here. So as you know, that can be a contentious experience. But for me, what brings me peace, what brings me healing, and what also allows for me to do that rigorous work of learning and teaching is the art, and engaging with others through the art. So that's what brought me here, and that's what I'm hoping to continue doing in the work I'm doing with youth, because I also know that my K-12, I never had that experience to do it this way. I'm only able to do it now, like as an adult. And I think that this is important for, youth to have access to and to do as well.
Yeah, so in essence, you found yourself within the spirit of Ubuntu, Botu, humanity, kindness, engage in the spirit of healing and through art forms. This question is going to be going to both of you, Taylor and Dan. Why Ubuntu in the first place? And in the process, did you even think Pan-Africanism, or if you like, decolonization, if you want to tackle any of those, you have the freedom and the leeway to do it. But why Ubuntu in the first place? Because that is the central theme of your work.
I think we were so fortunate to stumble upon Ubuntu, honestly. So why Ubuntu? It's because it started there. For me, when I had my opportunity to spend a summer volunteering somewhere and I was looking at organizations, I actually learned about Hoops for Hope in Zimbabwe through an ESPN article about the Boston Celtics that was talking all about Ubuntu. The NBA team, the Boston Celtics, who won the 2008 NBA championship, won it under the mantra of Ubuntu. They had someone from Hoops for Hope talk to them at a fundraiser before their season and talked all about Ubuntu. And Doc Rivers, the head coach of the Celtics at the time, really, really enjoyed that philosophy and thought it could be very important to his team, specifically as they brought together 3 superstar players onto one team, and people worried about how their chemistry would be and how only one ball, but those 3 players and the rest of the players too, and how are they going to make that work? And so Ubuntu became their team mantra. They broke down every huddle, 1 through 3 Ubuntu at the end of practice. They wrote it on their shoes. They won the championship, and they put Ubuntu on their rings. So I actually learned through my interest in sports and basketball, I learned about Ubuntu, and I learned about Hoops for Hope in that way. So that's how Hoops for Hope came on my radar. And it was there in Zimbabwe when I saw it as one of their core principles of their 7 tools that they teach their kids every day, that I thought, well, this is African philosophy. This is, I'm here in Zimbabwe, and like Ulep, everyone has kind of their own definition of what it meant there. But I thought, but this is universal. This is universal. There's a different name for this everywhere. And this philosophy should be applied everywhere. So for us, although it is a sports documentary, it's about this young Zimbabwean, my host little brother, who I lived with for those 2 months. It's about his journey to make it to the US to get a college education through basketball. And it's about that first ever Africa game, a historic achievement, for the league and for the growth of the game. And it's about the Boston Celtics 08 championship story and some of the African legends who paved the way. But this might not have been our intention at the time, but it's certainly easy to connect the dots now, especially in the context of this conversation with this group within Pan-Africanism, looking at, we highlight the African legends, the first players to make it professionally, Hakeem Olajuwon from Nigeria, and Dikembe Mutombo from DRC, and looking at Manupol, who's Sudanese, and all of these players who first made it to the NBA, who really paved the way for all of the growth now. If you watch an NBA game now, some of the best players are, show their heritage of across the continent. So for us, looking at it now, it really is about all of these players who have helped grow the game. It's about my host little brother, Watira Mukukula, who made it to the US for his education, and he's in his senior year now on a full scholarship, kind of birthed through the idea of his basketball ability, but morphed into his academic ability too, to get him a scholarship. So he thinks and talks a lot about that and some of the opportunity that's been granted for other people with Hoops for Hope to come to the US for education. But then on the flip side of that, also the growth of the game has allowed for a lot of growth on the continent itself, not just exporting these players in that sense to the US. It's right there, homegrown, starting a professional league. So this year was the debut league of the Basketball Africa League. So the NBA and FIBA partnered together to create a professional league on the African continent. This year they piloted it with 13 teams from 13 different countries. So I think that's giving rise to the game, both from an industry standpoint, but also so there can be more hoops for hopes out there. You know, I hope that the use of basketball will then be able to continue to seep down to the community level, the grassroots level for youth engagement and stuff. So it all started with Ubuntu for us and unraveled from there. And I'm sure Dan can give his own perspective, having met me on that plane that day when I was all fired up about it.
Thank you. Then when you respond, you know, you can add on to what Taylor has just said and also consider why sport. I mean, especially because you've done this work also in New York.
Yeah. So Taylor's discovery of Ubuntu is more interesting than mine. I mean, he told me about it. I learned it from Taylor when he was telling me about the Hoops for Hope organization. And I think that, you know, I think I mentioned earlier that, I mean, Ubuntu, it's just, so we grow up, I grew up, you know, playing sports, playing organized sports and team sports as a way of just of growing as a person and learning how to get along with others and learning about teamwork, and all of those things were kind of used as a basis of developing as a child and learning life lessons. And I think that, I mean, that's, you know, you're not going to win games if you're not getting along and working together and working out your differences, and looking out for the team as a whole. And I mean, that's like at its most simple definition, what Ubuntu means. The best definition that I think I've ever heard of Ubuntu, when people ask me, well, what does that mean? I am because of you. I am because of you. You are because of me. Like we can't exist without each other, and we can't move ahead without each other. And that definition has really resonated with me. And when applied into the context of sports, it just makes sense. And I think that the concept of Ubuntu is you can, you know, there's a lot to unpack and examine there. You know, in our film, you know, we tried our best to do it within a 50-minute, time frame while examining all these other stories. But I think that on a micro level, you have, you know, you look out for your family and your community, and that's what Hoops for Hope organization encourages. Mentorship and bringing the community together around the basketball court, and working together that way. And then on a more macro level, in our film, we examined the expansion of the NBA across the world, specifically in Africa, and how that brings people together from all different parts of the continent. And surrounding the NBA Africa game, there were many events that occurred. There were training, camps for kids. The NBA Cares is an organization that was present, and they had events for kids. And Watita, who is one of the main characters in our story, attended the camps with Basketball Without Borders, which is a global organization. But in this specific instance, when we were there, they brought children together from different countries all over Africa to participate in camps and exhibition games with each other. And so we had, so that on a macro level is bringing people all together, and, without admittedly not really knowing anything about Pan-Africanism before being invited to the symposium. Unbeknownst to me, that's kind of what was happening while we were on the ground there. We were seeing it happen in real time. And that's Ubuntu is just, there's so many levels of it to examine, and there's so many different ways to discuss it. So, and then, like I said earlier, why sport? I mean, I grew up playing sports. I love sports, and it's had such a positive impact on my life. And it's you know, a very powerful tool that can be used to bring people together and to make people better people. So.
Great. I would like you to be as brief as possible, maybe under 30 seconds if you can. Let's tackle one of the most challenging issues with sport, and that is how do we reconcile the spirit, intrinsic value of Ubuntu, as an example, or even Pan-Africanism within the context of sport and art? Reconcile the challenges that we face with issues of equity, inclusion and access, especially to underserved communities, and programs that are probably would be running in different parts of Africa or here in the United States that are not accessible to a majority of the kids. And we want to teach Ubuntu or the whole spirit of Pan-Africanism, as I've indicated, of how Pan-Africanism has, you know, permeated life across the continent and other parts of the world, in particular the diaspora. So how do we reconcile those contradictions in very, very, very quick responses? We can start with you, Liv, and then Taylor can jump in as well.
I think for this one, I'll defer to the other folks on the panel. I don't really have much sport background or any comments to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that oftentimes with sports, there's winners and losers, and there are some who have barriers of entry to participate. And for me, why I love Hoops for Hope and why I think I found value in sports, specifically for social impact and storytelling, is that is to use, like, Hoops for Hope uses basketball in a way that teaches values that are really everlasting and go far beyond sport. I think it's just such an opportunity for community building. So I think one of the difficulties there is what I just mentioned, of the winners and the losers, and there can be a fallacy that basketball, for instance, is maybe one's only way out. But I think that's why when you can use basketball to teach a value like Ubuntu, those are everlasting values that can far exceed and be much longer lasting than what you're learning on the court. So those are some of the challenges, but also some of the hopes of someone like Hoops for Hope teaching these life skills that will last a lot longer than even the basketball skills.
Real quickly, I mean, I think that there's a very simple barrier of accessibility. I mean, you know, soccer is such an accessible sport. If you know, and you can play it anywhere. If you can find a ball to play with, it doesn't matter, you know, in a little bit of space. Basketball is a little less accessible. I mean, you need a hoop, you need that to play with. And I think, you know, I think that's some of the important work that Hoops for Hope is doing is building courts around in different neighborhoods and parks so that kids have access to the sport. And, you know, and then that can be a communal space to start some of these more organized lessons and organizations.
Yeah. So while the audience is putting together some questions, we got in a minute, I'm going to be inviting the audience to take part in the discussion and keep throwing your questions in there in the chat, and then we'll move over to them. I just want to throw in one challenging issue here into the conversation on issues of Ubuntu, Pan-Africanism, decolonization, and issues of race, equity, and social justice that athletes have to deal with in society, especially minority athletes or Black athletes. We can take an example of the European soccer final between Italy and England that took place on Sunday, and how that translated into some very difficult circumstances for English players, or British English players who actually missed penalties. How do we really address some of these issues and the challenges? Taking the knee, raising a fist, like Jesse Owens did back in the in the day, trying to reconcile being a hero when you are doing well and being a villain when you don't, and also trying just to balance, how much you fit into a majority society as a Black athlete and the like. Any comments on that? This actually does not only translate to sport; it could also be in art forms and things like that. Can we tackle that in a minute, and then we transition to the audience?
I mean, I could briefly. I mean, I think that I can't imagine being in a position of the athletes are put in, where, on one hand, you're revered and people want to hear what you have to say as long as they agree with it. And if they don't agree with it, keep your mouth shut. Don't, just play the game that you're paid to play. I think that the sport provides such an important platform to raise awareness and to create dialogue and movements that are so important. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe Taylor might have some thoughts on that, on some of these issues there.
One thing I could just say is that it seems to be a pretty important time in the life of an athlete, specifically Black athletes, and to be able to use their platform to speak up and out against injustices, and hopefully their teammates and the fans as well. I think always sports on such a large platform exposes the racism that permeates throughout society, but I think now more than ever, leagues, teams, players, fans are using the arena and using the field to advocate and for their activism and to try to point out some of these injustices. So I think one thing I'm liking specifically about basketball, but other sports too, is that it seems to be a part of the ethos, a part of the DNA right now, to allow for sports and social impact to be one, and an athlete can speak out on these things. So I'm hoping that that's more and more that platform can be used that way, and that people can be more accepting of the players they cheer for, and the players with their platforms can possibly change some minds and change some hearts along the way. That's something that I've been thankful for the NBA for, in the way that they've attempted to be more forward with their social justice efforts. Nowhere near perfect, but as compared to some other leagues, I've appreciated their efforts along the way and hope that only continues to grow.
Thank you. Go ahead, Lynn.
Well, I would first preface with, again, I don't really have a lot of sport background, but I do appreciate the conversations these days on decolonizing sports, and especially how we are capitalizing on Black bodies. I think that's just another part of that process that we definitely have a lot of work to do on. I also really appreciate Vanessa's comment that I just saw in the chat, speaking further to this. And it even just makes me think about what's happening right now with the Olympics. I've been seeing a lot of folks talking about even, what's her name, Sha'Carri, I think, one of the runners who was disqualified for something like using marijuana or something. And I saw another post where somebody was talking about how we use this for, medicinal purposes, or to calm your nerves, or to, handle anxiety, things that are very real to a lot of people, and about how stuff like this is being, it's, again, controlling the bodies, and a lot of that systems of control can be seen there. And I think we definitely had a lot of work to do in terms of how we are humanizing and being really humanizing in how we are participating in and viewing sports and sport events.
At this point, I'm going to get, I think Liv has already tried to tackle in some ways the comment by Vanessa. So Vanessa, do you have any thoughts here that you want to share? You talk about sport narratives in South Africa by the work of Odendal and Cleophas. Can you comment on that? I mean, you're posing a question, and I'm sure that you may have a perspective on it in just 30 seconds to a minute. Do you mind?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. We can hear you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah, and I think it's just important, in what Liv mentioned, it's not necessarily about naming the athletes that we need to honor. It's about how we look at the whole process of looking at Black athletes, women, and how women's bodies are depicted as being too muscular or not too muscular. So I think it's not necessarily around naming people, but also the whole process of how we depict people and how spaces are opened up, so that we're looking at inconservative spaces. So we're not looking just specifically at names of people, but we also need to contribute to how we see them, how they place within society, and how we use what they've, their histories and their legacies. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but I mean, I think it's not just about naming people or giving their histories, but also how we decolonize the whole history and understand how these colonial narratives have become fixed in the literature and the minds of people, so that those kinds of mindsets are also almost decolonized and not necessarily just the names of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I think one comment is about how do we balance exploitation and opportunities in especially in underserved communities, and do we need to reorganize the sports? I think Philip has asked the question: should we be thinking about reorganizing the sports and into more inclusive platforms and Ubuntu type engagements? So, Philip, do you mind for 30 seconds just elaborating on that and what your thoughts are, and then we can have Greta to say something.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I didn't know you were going to put me on the spot. I was just asking because, you know, a lot of our athletes excel abroad, and that's the attraction. And we're talking about Ubuntu sports as a platform through which to reinforce Ubuntu. And yet a lot of our athletes don't seem to be encouraged on the continent. I mean, all you have to do is look at the French soccer team. You know, it's got to the point that you have French citizens actually beginning to complain that this doesn't look like a French team anymore. So my point is, what can we do to really, because these young people are very talented, and they just need a channel through which to express that talent, and we don't seem to be giving them that channel in a lot of our countries, and so that's my point essentially. I don't want to go over 30 seconds. So yeah. What can we do for the young people as far as sports? That's my point. Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. Greta, do you want to add something before I invite one of our panelists to react to that?
Just briefly, the conversation that was held, that was the statements that were made earlier about the economic impact of decolonization and Ubuntu, and how do we grapple with that? My comment about exploitation, and that is, we know in America that the sporting mindsets of young people start very, very early, and it infuses into college, and what happens in a very small percentage of these people make it to the NBA or the professional leagues for very, very short periods of time. And so we have this misconception that on so many levels, and then the unjust and inequitable resources and players and all that kind of stuff. We cannot forget that oftentimes that is exploitation of bodies, humans. And we need to address that throughout.
Yeah, great interventions, colleagues. Any quick reactions from our panelists, Taylor, Dan? Because I think there's a lot more about sport and exploitation and balancing the commercial interest and the intrinsic values of sport.
As someone who operates a lot within the sports landscape, these are conversations that I think about a lot and that are happening a lot. So I'm really glad that you all, invited them into this space. I think that's something that's interesting, something that's happening rather timely in the US as in the NCAA with college athletes and introducing the name, image, and likeness bill for finally these players to be able to profit in some way while they're in college. I think that's something that has been a long outdated system that is long overdue in its attempt to reward those for their hard works and efforts. I also think that it all comes back to Hoops for Hope for me, but I'm really fortunate that to me, it feels fortunate that basketball can be used at the grassroots level, more on the life skills side of things than even into a promise of opportunity to be a professional. I think there's such a fallacy in that regard of what basketball can mean in terms of financial opportunity and making it professionally. But what is for sure is that it can offer community and it can offer important learnings, especially for the youth, to be able to better their work ethic and better their acceptance of others and better their self-esteem, etc. So I think those are where I always lean back on sports, and now serving on the board of Hoops for Hope Zimbabwe is realizing that for the most part, basketball for these kids is the court is a safe space for them to have community and for them to have mentors and for them to be supported. And those are the intrinsic values that I really appreciate in youth sports. And then one more thing, just on, I mentioned earlier with the Basketball Africa League that has started recently, but also I think there's been a large effort to keep the most talented players across the African continent on the African continent, to provide more opportunities there. So it's not just a situation where Watita says, I need to get to the US to go to school. The NBA and FIBA has partnered to do a top academy system for all of the top players there to come in and get schooling and full scholarship schooling, and also health insurance and all of the like. And it's bringing together different players of different countries across the African continent to train and play and learn together. So these are just little efforts that I think are maybe some of the conversations and concerns that you are raising are starting to seep into the consciousness of all of this and all of the big machine that sports is. And I hope it can continue to even involve more of these thoughts more, because they're certainly necessary.
Thank you very much, Taylor. We have Cynthia. Cynthia, you have something to say. You're welcome to share with us.
Hi, I just wanted to kind of bring it back to the healing aspect, and then get Liv's thoughts about using art to heal from the decolonization. It's like I hear the talk and about everything, and I'm struggling because I have my own organization that's called Nia Imani, and it's science-based, but it was bringing that. And now this conversation has given me more words to add to the conversation. But I struggled with wanting my organization to be, African-centered, Black, power to the people. But then I was faced with, but we have to include everybody, right? And then, but there's this hurt there. And so how do we heal from the hurt moving forward and not going to the opposite extreme of dismissing, I don't want to say hating other groups, but dismissing other groups for the sake of ours coming to the forefront, if that makes sense.
Liv, can you tackle that very quickly so that we can squeeze in another person, another comment?
Yes. Well, thank you, Cynthia, for that question. Really great question. And we can talk further about it, definitely one-on-one. Well, one thing I'd like to say for that is, for me, it really comes to unlearning and learning, like unlearning some of those damaging viewpoints and ideologies and those paradigms that we've taken on, especially through our schooling, about what teaching and learning is supposed to look like, what science learning is supposed to look like, things like that. And part of that unlearning can look like what we think science learning is supposed to look like. Like, I know I'm working with folks now who are within this field of science and science learning and are working to tell science from a storytelling point of view. Think about your own stories with science. Think about your own interactions with science. Document those memories, where they actually come from. And some people document, like for me, I would document like learning to cook with my grandmother. She literally taught me these practices that are based, science. And that was where I learned some of the basic things about science and matter. And learning those stories for me and documenting and having that memory documenting and taking note of the ways that we interact with science and learn and engage every day is a part of that healing practice that must happen, and a part of that engagement that must happen for you to reconceptualize what learning in whatever aspect, whatever field that you're in should look like. And I think coming from that point of memory and experience, and then sharing that in community with others to, reconceptualize together collectively, is really important for that healing and that learning to happen.
Thank you very much, Lee, for that. And I think the point that was being raised by Cynthia really relates to, for instance, when you talk about decolonization and the art form and healing, Could we be thinking more about, changing the narratives, changing, decolonizing the mind, in other words, as it were. So those are some of the conversations that I think are very important to have. Very quickly, we would have, I think, let me see here. Donis, do you have something to say for 30 seconds? I think I have a window here before we move on to closing remarks. Yes.
Thank you very much, brother. I'm very new to this, so I was thrown off just a smidget when you guys were talking about decolonization, and then you were talking about the Black athlete in Africa. And so it kind of came to me real quick that the Black athlete now is the new commodity for other countries to exploit and to make serious dollars off of. Think about them taking those athletes from Africa, any of those countries in Africa, and taking them to France, and they becoming a good, excellent soccer team or whatever sport it is like that. So when I'm thinking about decolonization, I'm thinking about maybe a new form of neo-colonialism coming on with this, with the taking of, again, Black athletes from Africa and taking them abroad, but not redeveloping Africa itself. Africa should be should have its own platform like these other major countries have on itself. Then that's just my opinion within those 30 seconds. Thank you very much, brother.
Thank you, Donis. I think these are conversations to be had, and in the future, one of the things we'll be looking at is maybe picking one of these and really delving deep into each one of them as a conversation to appreciate some of the issues and the controversies, because these are all very, very important. At this point, what I would like to do is to ask members of the panel, because we only have 4 minutes, to take 30 seconds to share, to make concluding remarks or closing remarks, and maybe share any of the nagging issues that they may have. And this is going to be like in no more than a minute. So we start with you, Liv.
All right, sorry, my cat just jumped up here as soon as you called my name. But I guess to conclude, I would say, one, I really love spaces like this because I really do think collecting and collaborating is very important and is an essential part of, doing this work and building and making sure, that the futures that we want to envision actually are materialized. And I guess one of the main struggles I'm having right now is some of the stuff that I want to do, I've never actually seen myself. I've never actually experienced myself yet. This liberating teaching and learning, like through the arts with all this visual, it's embodied by a lot of bits and pieces of things, and I've put together over time and that I've seen and experienced, and within historical roots. But some of this I haven't necessarily seen, and I think some of what the youth today are visioning for their future is something that we haven't necessarily seen or experienced yet. But I think, collecting, telling stories about what we like to envision, telling stories about what we like to manifest, and like we're speaking it into being and then building on that speaking is really important and really essential. And it's something that I'm thinking about now. So I guess I'd like to just leave with that, continue speaking and bringing it into being, and we'll build it. It'll happen.
Thank you very much. Really words of wisdom. Taylor?
I think, today certainly made this even clearer, but I think some of the struggles for me exist in a lot of the sports spaces that are, on one hand, oftentimes pretty capitalist driven and have a lot of flaws. And what we've talked about today is balancing that and trying to better that and trying not to further that, and I think that's why, fortunately, it's on the other hand, I so enjoy my time with Hoops for Hope and other similar organizations that are doing more on the ground grassroots works with providing youth development. I think that's been part of the purpose of this panel. So I think balancing those two things, the intrinsic values that sports can provide really positively, and looking more broadly at potentially some of the negative impacts, or maybe just where there's work to be done. And I think this panel attacked a lot of those issues, which I think is really good. And I wanted actually to end with a quote from a student, from one of the many students who's watched the film, just a couple of their definitions of Ubuntu. One said to me, Ubuntu means caring for others. This message helps me look at others differently and makes me want to help others more. Another said, I love Ubuntu as something that should always be happening. Always, always. And someone said, after seeing the film, Ubuntu to me means overall goodness and that we are all on this together. I'm trying to live Ubuntu to be more kind and helpful to others. And these are from some 12 and 13-year-olds from North Carolina. So I thought I'd end it with a couple notes from some students who learned about Ubuntu this year.
Thank you for sharing. You have the shortest time possible, Dan, but I know you can manage that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a great start of a great conversation to continue to be had. I mean, like Taylor said, you know, there's so many positives that, you know, sports, there's so many positive aspects of sport, you know, especially on a grassroots level. But then on a larger scale, on a more global level, like some of the issues that, you know, I'd like to examine more is, you know, like the NBA expanding to Africa. Obviously, that could be a positive thing, but you know, I don't think they'd be doing it if there wasn't a financial incentive there. And so I think, you know, further discussing how to keep the positivity in sports, even on a larger scale with larger organizations like the NBA is important to discuss and for me to keep exploring.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan. At this juncture, what I would like to say is that, you know, I think this panel and all of you participants in this discussion, really thank you very much for the opportunity to explore these issues. I think the fundamental issues here are, how do we center sport, art, and other, you know, human endeavors? Our interest was in sport and art, other human endeavors in the building of youth, development of youth, empowerment of youth, in particular African transformation, because when you talk youth, you're talking transformation, the future. So the key things are about autonomous systems that can actually take upon themselves the need to chart a destiny that is only meaningful, that actually is relevant to their context, and so on and so forth. I think we're learning a lot from this panel in terms of some of the issues that are there, what needs to be addressed, balancing the commercial value of sport, as well as the need to make a living and to learn from sport with a view to applying those principles in the endless possibilities that life has to offer. I think this is my take from this discussion, and we are saying a conversation to be continued. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for your contributions. I think I'll just now pass on to Beza, because I think Beza and Upenyu, because this is the time. Thank you very much, Taylor. Thank you, Liv. Thank you, Dan. And yeah, this is it from our side.